The last three trumpets of Act 2 are spoken of as woes that afflict the inhabitants of the earth, meaning those whose life is lived as if the earthly dimension is all there is to reality. So two of the trumpets have been blown, and therefore two of the woes have been revealed and unleashed. But the third woe that comes to the inhabitants of the earth is introduced by the last of the 7 trumpet blasts, which is blown only at the end of the interlude, which we dealt with in the last video. And that opens the way for the third act of the drama. What this woe is only made clear in verse 12 of chapter 12. Now the sevenfold pattern of the previous acts is found in this act as well, though it is not so obvious. There are 7 signs of cosmic conflict, each introduced by the words, and then I saw, and I saw, or then I saw, or then I looked. The third act consists of 2 scenes. Chapter 12 reveals the nature of the spiritual conflict that lies behind the situation in which followers of Jesus find themselves during this age. And in chapter 13, the impostors are unmasked and the true nature of the Antichrist is revealed. The symbolic cast found in the first scene has been drawn from Genesis chapter 3, the woman and her offspring and the serpent and the enmity that has existed between them from of old. This scene raises the question of spiritual warfare. How real is this? What is it really all about? And how should Christians engage in this? What realities are the biblical authors referring to when talking about Satan and demons and the devil? What is the place of the desert in our spiritual pilgrimage? Now remember, we are not watching a documentary film, but witnessing a vision. The development of the plot is not strictly chronological, but in this particular scene there are 3 parts, or there are 3 parts to it. The first I call a tale of 2 signs. So we are introduced to the 2 signs of the 7 that are in the whole act as a whole, and our high calling. That's in verses 1 to 6. Then we have D-Day in heaven and our high ground, verses 7 to 12. And then conflict on earth and our desert bunker in verses 13 to 17. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple, and there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. These verses introduce the chief characters in the cosmic drama that lies behind history and outlines the key objectives of the conflict. The pregnant woman about to give birth, well, we're introduced to the archetypical woman who, according to Genesis 3, was to bring forth children in pain. However, here she is presented as the glorified Israel in celestial array, crowned with 12 stars, which is just like what Joseph saw in his dream in Genesis 37. She represents the ideal of God's people throughout all ages. She is Mary, but only insofar as she embodies faithful Israel and mothers the Messiah in his community. Another comment from John Sweet. She is the daughter of Zion, out of whom will come the Messiah, prophesied in Micah 5 verse 3. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. The first thing to emphasize is that in Jewish thinking, there was no notion of the devil as an anti-God separate from the divine unity itself. Now, if you want to find out more about this, read Elaine Pagel's book, either Adam, Eve and the Serpent, or another book called The Origin of Satan. Both of these are academic books. However, there was a belief that various aspects of our own humanity, created in the image of God, are capable of leading us astray, and these were given various names, all of which have a particular meaning. So the tempter tests and proves our worth, and Satan simply means adversary, and the devil is the accuser or slanderer. But the Aramaic version of the New Testament uses two words to convey what the devil does. One meaning to devour, which is like being eaten up by envious desire, and another meaning something that stings and ridicules. So the latter idea, of course, lies behind the depiction of demonic forces as locusts with human faces and a scorpion's tail. Now, none of these were proper names. They were not meant to be understood as beings, let alone a being with a separate personality or identity. What we know about the human mind and how it works today is it is better to think of these qualities of the human as qualities of the human psyche or of collective consciousness. And when we read of the serpent in Genesis 3, it stands for that aspect of a person's mind that winds around itself, which is what the roots of the word in Hebrew point to. And the aspect of our mind that becomes self-absorbed and greedy or selfish. And it is found even outside the biblical tradition and is called various names like Leviathan, Rahab, which means pride, or Tiamat, and is identified in the Old Testament with the spiritual power behind the political oppression of Egypt in Psalm 74. But this same power lies behind all oppressive governments in whatever shape or form. In Jeremiah's day, it was Babylon. In Daniel, it appears as a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. In Daniel 7, which actually imply authority and the fact that it's very difficult to get rid of. But the fact that the devil sweeps only a third of the stars out of the sky and flings them down to earth, which we find in Daniel 8 as well as Revelation 8, underlies the truth that the greater angelic force is still faithful to God. That is, if we understand angels representing, that means messenger, as the inner life of human society, therefore that gives me hope that there's something hidden in human psyche that will be able to still respond to God. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. The rod of iron with which the male child whom God calls his son will rule the nations is lifted from Psalm 2. But when Micah prophesies that a woman will be in labor and bring forth a ruler who will rule his people, it is someone who will bring peace on earth, Micah 4 and 5. So when the Greek translation of the Old Testament translates ruler in both these references as shepherd, and so we're meant to remember that the shepherd rules by laying down his life for the sheep. So the Church's high calling is to give birth to Christ-like people as Mary gave birth to the man-child who is Christ himself. But to do so we must be ready for the pain of labour. As the suffering of creation is bringing the new creation to birth, which Paul says in Romans 8, so the suffering of God's people is bringing a new creation of Christ-likeness to birth in them. Paul in Galatians 4 says, "My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you." If the aim of our existence is to give birth to Christ-like people, then the objective of the enemy is the destruction of all that is Christ-like. Hence he stands ready in the labour room, much as Pharaoh did, to destroy the male offspring of Israel in the Exodus story, and as Herod attempted to destroy Jesus when he heard of his birth. Verse 5 alludes not to the flight to Egypt, but to the resurrection and ascension of Christ. It omits the central event of the cross. However, in the light of the following verses, it is clear that his route to safety, as is ours, was via that cross. In verse 6, the flight of the woman into the desert is not only built upon the Exodus story, but also on what happened to the church in Jerusalem at the time of its destruction by Rome. They took the prophetic warnings of Jesus seriously, and so were saved. But the fact that John mentions the enigmatic time period of 1,260 days indicates that the meaning is not exhausted in those events. This chapter concentrates on the cosmic conflict that occurred in the spiritual dimensions, that is, the heavens, at the time of the cross, during which the fate of humanity hung in the balance. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, and that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. And he was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah, for the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows his time is short." Once again, we have something that John saw in verses 7 to 9 interpreted for us by what he heard. He saw a military battle, and often we think of spiritual warfare in these terms, but the victory gained over the forces of Satan is moral rather than military. And what he hears is the language of law courts. The public prosecutor's case has been overturned. Satan, the public prosecutor, has lost his right to prosecute. And we can think of passages in the Old Testament that illustrate this too. Job chapter 1 and 2, for example, and Zechariah 3, because he had prosecuted someone who was actually innocent. So Jesus speaks of the downfall of Satan when he's talking about the mission of his disciples who cast out demons in his name, Luke chapter 10. And now the sphere of Satan's operation is confined to earth, that is, in the realm of forms and not in the realm of essence. No longer has it the right to accuse Jesus' brothers and sisters before God in heaven, but he still accuses us, first to our own consciences, and then through the inhabitants of the earth who belong to him. So what bulwarks can we erect against his accusations today? The first is that our defense is based on what Jesus has accomplished through us, and the fact that we are forgiven because we are loved, and Jesus' death has demonstrated that clearly to us, that God's forgiveness is extended to us. And then there's the word of our testimony as well. But then our attitude, well, the early Christian martyrs did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Thankfully, we don't face that threat so often in this kind of in this world, in our country, but in the world there are plenty who do. And finally, it is our rejoicing in Christ's victory over the devil. So our adversary is therefore fearful, and his fear is seen in his fury. It's what Christ did for us, not through us. Sorry, I said my word was wrong there. Expelling the devil and Satan from heaven and limiting their activity to earth is actually the third and final woe for the inhabitants of the earth. Yet, as we shall see later, they take it as the greatest bliss. However, turning against the offspring of the woman, which is what Satan inspires them to do, turns out to be their greatest disaster. And in this way, God is handing people over to the consequences of ignoring him. So the wrath of God spoken of in Romans 1, as being revealed in godless society, is seen in Revelation to be executed by none other than Satan, him or himself. So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. These verses focus on the current situation in the last days. They are Satan's last days too, and we're talking about the whole period between the first and second comings of Christ. So his activity has a fury about it, born of the knowledge that his days are numbered. Now, Act 2 spoke of the ways in which God warns the inhabitants of the earth in terms of the plagues with which God smote Egypt. In this act, we see the spiritual personality behind the pharaohs of this world in the form of the red dragon chasing after the woman, much as Pharaoh did after the Israelites who were escaping into the desert. And as God carried them to safety on eagle's wings, Exodus 19:4, to be kept safe with him in the desert, so the woman in this vision is given the wings of an eagle with which to fly to safety. Isaiah 40, verse 31. So, contrary to many who interpret the desert as a place of wandering, the loss and lostness, before we come to the promised land of God's blessing, the New Testament consistently calls the disciples to come to the safety of the desert. John the Baptizer called his generation to come out to him in the desert. His baptism was a kind of fresh start for the community of faith, a remembering of the crossing over the Red Sea. The desert was a place when Israel learnt dependence on God in those Exodus journeys. When they wandered through the desert, they learnt to trust in God who nourished them and prepared them for conquest. It was viewed by subsequent generations as a place of intimacy with God, such as we find in Hosea chapter 2. It is only as the woman is in the desert that she can give birth to the man-child, or the kind of offspring which it is her calling to produce. Now, the desert bunker is also a testing place preparing us for reigning. The river of lies that spews out of the dragon's mouth still threatens to sweep us away today. So then, as the Israelites were threatened by the worship of the golden calf and the seductions of Balaam and Balak in the Exodus story, so the saints are threatened by the worship of the beast and the seductions of the false prophet in the chapter 13, which we're coming to. But the earth comes to the aid of the saints through the picture of the earth swallowing up the torrent of lives. And that comes from Exodus chapter 15 in reference to Israel's army, and also to Numbers 16, the rebellion of Korah. So there may have been a sense in which the testimony of God's creation, which is still good, comes to our aid in these days. What is creation telling us today? How is it warning us? Well, I think we can think about that one. So finally, the desert is a sort of bunker. It's a place of inner security. So we need to note that the period of inner security and outward vulnerability is again marked by the number 3.5. The message is that the reign of evil is permitted after the pattern of Christ's ministry and is limited and will eventually be overcome by God. The dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. So the woman introduced at the beginning of the chapter is also giving birth to the brothers and sisters of the Messiah, the rest of her offspring. Micah 5:3 also refers to that. So the woman's offspring have been, having bruised the serpent's head, it now turns, that's Jesus having bruised the serpent's heads, it now turns against the rest of her offspring to bruise their heel, to pick up the analogy from Genesis chapter 3. So the term also suggests that these are the faithful remnant, analogous to those who were faithful to Yahweh in ancient Israel. So they're therefore called those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus in spite of persecution. But whilst the woman, also representing the spiritual essence of the church, is kept safe in the desert, and the man-child, the Christ, has been snatched up to God, the rest of her offspring are vulnerable to Satan's attack. So the same theme of inward security and outward vulnerability that characterizes the life of the faithful in this age, which we found in the last act, is being explored from another angle, the angle of spiritual warfare in this present act. So in the next video, we'll be considering the nature of the attack on the woman's offspring in more detail, and finding out that the inner nature of the impostors that are really the Antichrist. So that's the theme of chapter 13, which I'll do in a separate video.